Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's virtual and hybrid actual talk with author Paisley Rekdal. She is our first in a series of our 2021-2022 Author Meets Readers. We are gathered here in Salt Lake City on the unceded ancestral lands of the Goshute, Ute, Eastern Shoshone, and Paiute peoples. And we're utilizing for some of our program the technology of Zoom to bring in our commentator, Nancy Leong. And Zoom is headquartered in San Jose, California, on the unceded ancestral territory of the El Honi peoples. We also acknowledge at Tanner Humanities that much of the prosperity of the United States we owe to the descendants of enslaved African peoples. So we offer these acknowledgments as a way to acknowledge our appreciation, to situate ourselves and provide context. I am Erica George. I'm the director of the Tanner Humanities Center. I am also the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And the Tanner Humanities Center is named for Obert and Grace A. Tanner. Here we promote the exploration of the humanities through three primary areas of emphasis: our academic research, our educational outreach, and our public engagement, of which you are a part today. We do this through support for faculty research and research interest groups, off-campus engagement, and support for K-12 teachers. Our work is made possible by the O.C. Tanner Foundation, the Zoo Arts and Parks Program, which is funded by you, the taxpayers of Utah, Utah Humanities, the College of Humanities, led by our Dean, Stuart Culver, who is here with us today, and the Tanner Humanities Center staff, with whom none of this would happen: Beth James, my Associate Director, my new Associate Director for Faculty, Jeremy Rosen, who also joins us today, Susan Anderson, our Development Officer, and Katie Pula, who is our Marketing Coordinator. So thank you for joining us for this event. We launched Author Meets Readers in fall of 2020 in response to what we saw as a need to celebrate the emerging and established humanities writers among us, and to bring together our lifelong learners, our current students, and new audiences to engage with contemporary topics. Today's program will involve our featured author and former fellow, Paisley Rekdal, in conversation with Nancy Leong, who is joining us from University of Denver Law School, who has written on similar topics. I will announce and introduce Nancy later in the program. She is with us listening in, and I will introduce Paisley for you now. Professor Rekdal is the author of a book of essays, The Night My Mother Met Bruce Lee, the hybrid phototext memoir Intimate, and 5 books of poetry, including A Crash of Rhinos, 6 Girls Without Pants, The Invention of the Kaleidoscope, Animal Eye, and in 2013 she was a finalist for the Kingsley Prize, and she's also written Imaginary Vessels. In 2018 she was a finalist for the Kingsley Tufts Prize and the Washington State Book Award. Her newest book of nonfiction is a book-length essay, The Broken Country, on Trauma, a Crime, and the Continuing Legacy of Vietnam. She's got a number of collected poems books, including Nightingale, which rewrites many of the myths of Ovid, and appropriately we'll be talking about rewriting and reimagining in her work today. The Metamorphosis, which was published in spring 2019, and most recently, Appropriate, a Provocation, which we are here to talk about today. That was published by Norton in 2021. And last year, she was very busy editing the Best American Poetry series for 2020. She's received a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's also a Tanner Fellow, a former Tanner Fellow. She's received a Fulbright Fellowship. She's much celebrated, and the accolades are much deserved. She's also a dear friend. She's the Distinguished Professor at the University of Utah, where she directs, where she is a creator and editor, most recently, of West, which is available online, and we will make available on our website. She's got some interesting community projects I would also commend to you, including Mapping Literary Utah and Mapping Salt Lake City. These are both digital works of humanities research. She was named Utah's Poet Laureate in 2017. She is still with us as the Poet Laureate and is doing some really wonderful work around the state. She does so much. We're really appreciative of her time today. She also, in this book, wrote about reading. So I wanted to just share an excerpt to start our conversation. The way our Author Meets Readers conversations work is they're not formal presentations. They're unscripted conversations. She has no idea what I am going to ask her, and I don't really have much of an idea of where this will go. But there's certain things that I do want to draw forth, because this is an important contemporary conversation that's often fraught with a lot of emotion and anger and rage. So reading does work for us, and we do work as readers. In this book, in her final chapter, the conceit of this book is a series of letters in response to a student question. Paisley, first and foremost, is a teacher as well as a scholar and writer, and teaching comes with responsibility. And she engages on this journey answering what would at first seem a simple question from a student about cultural appropriation. Near the end of the series of letters to her student, who's a writing student, she's teaching creative writers, she writes about readers. And as this is our Author Meets Readers, I wanted to share some of that. Paisley writes that literature is the expression of conflicting human desires, and reading is the activation of these conflicts, the dynamic engagement of word and idea. So when we are reading, there's a porousness, she writes, that occurs between writer and reader. The writer shapes a character, the reader is invited to see herself in relation to, and in doing so, the reader gives herself up to the text. She relates some of her aspect of her own identity when reading a character. This empathetic liaison between text and reader is, of course, something only the reader can activate. But writers work hard to pierce that veil between self and between other, and also what constitutes writer and reader. So we are in relationship to what it is we read. I think you would almost suggest that perhaps is self-constituting what we engage with when we engage with texts. Why did you feel the need to write to your student of writing about readers?
Because I think when we start talking about cultural appropriation, we're thinking not just about cultural performances, but what cultural performances do to us when we take them in. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest anxieties around cultural appropriation in classrooms that I'm teaching in is not only in what ways am I, quote unquote, getting it wrong as a writer, but as a reader, am I being somehow infected by the bad literary values of people who got it wrong in the past? There's currently calls from campuses across the country. Do we still read Ovid? It's a text that's full of rape. Do we still read John Berryman? It's a man who is a poet who wrote in the voice of a sort of minstrel figure. Do we read Hemingway? The question is, when we have so many new writers, women writers, writers of color coming up and can be being published now, should we just supplant these texts with texts that speak more to our moment? And, one of the questions that I wrestle with, in teaching is, how do you present a text in a way that does not whitewash any of the difficulties and complexities, not just of the text, but also potentially of the author's life, because people are as interested in that as anything else. One of the things that also struck me when I was writing this book was how I, as a teacher, maybe inadvertently, was walking into classrooms presenting literature as an aspirational value. And that in itself was wrong in a way, like when especially in creative writing, you're presenting students with models to go out and repopulate the world with these kinds of books and these kinds of texts. But with the idea of the aspirational value, then comes the idea of, do I duplicate everything that I'm seeing on that page, including the mistakes that those authors could not possibly have anticipated, or maybe did anticipate and wrote into? Okay. And so I realized that actually the work that I primarily am trying to do as a literature scholar, not a creative writing professor, is something different, which is to think about the text as a kind of, and I probably shouldn't use this metaphor, as a kind of battlefield, a place in which you are there in order not to find your own values duplicated or replicated in any exact way, but to figure out what you do stand for, what you do believe, that you are not meant to be an unthinking participant in the reading of a text. You are there not as an antagonist exactly, but as somebody who is there to figure out what you like, what you don't like, what you agree with, what you don't agree with, and to figure out what the shortcomings of the text are in really fascinating ways. And that's why I can teach really bad literature to great effect. I think all of us have taught Dracula, know that is in some ways a terrible book, but it's the terribleness of that novel that becomes the most fruitful, critical place to depart from, to sort of say, wow, how do we read this as a text about immigration? How do we read this as a text about, queer desires? How do we read this as a text that uses women's bodies in very particular ways? How does race enter a text that supposedly does not address race at all? Okay. And it's through the slippages that become the most interesting thing. And that is the way that I would say, if we want to use the word rescue, that we rescue the past. We think about it as, something I was reading by Hannah Arendt. She was, thinking about the past and saying that the past is not there to be duplicated thoughtlessly. The past exists as a question of which values do you choose to redefine and rescue because they can withstand potentially futurity. And I think that that's a question that's always inherent to any kind of literary text. There's no reason to teach one thing or another. It's always a series of choices. And as readers, there is always a choice in what ways you want to engage the text.
Okay.
So, yeah, sorry, that was like a really long answer, but I've been
great.
thinking about this forever now.
This book I recommend highly. This is tremendous. I was blown away, seriously. This was incredible. And it grapples with, I too am a teacher, I'm a law professor. There are conversations about why are all of our edited case books, including the cases we include, and why are they edited by a particular type of individual. And being mindful that there are choices that we are maybe making unconsciously, non-consciously, and that we're empowered as readers to make different choices and make a difference. I want to talk to you about the complicit reader, of which I think I am one. So in letter 3, chapter 3, what's lovely about this book is Paisley engages different texts. She takes in poetry, she takes in excerpts of novels. You take up Hannah Arendt, which I do want to talk to you about because I also teach that. But you introduced me to a poem called How To. Would you like to read that, or should I read that?
I'll read it,
Okay.
and if I can find it in my
It's on page 59.
Oh, here it is. Yeah, thanks. Okay. This is by a poet named Anders Carlson Wee. And
Don't tell them anything more than that.
I won't say anything. All right, so, and it was published in The Nation, and it kicked up a massive firestorm. So this is the poem in its entirety. If you got HIV, say AIDS. If you're a girl, say you're pregnant. Nobody gonna lower themselves to listen for the kick. People passing fast, splay your legs, cock a knee, funny. It's the littlest shames they're likely to comprehend. Don't say homeless, they know you is. What they don't know is what opens a wallet, what stops them from counting what they drop. If you're young, say younger. Old, say older. If you're crippled, don't flaunt it. Let them think they're good enough Christians to notice. Don't say you pray, say you sin. It's about who they believe they is. You hardly even there.
Okay. Confessional. I read that poem without knowing anything about the author. There's power in who authors and who an author is. As a reader, I read a lot into that. I could hear the voice of perhaps an advising, elderly, homeless black man telling you how to do it, how to survive on these streets. And this became, for me, a poem about guidance and instruction. Why was I wrong in that
You're
reading?
not wrong. You're not wrong. You are meant to see this, I think, as a poem about guidance and instruction. And I think the question, it's interesting that you immediately thought an older black man. We know homeless because the speaker announces himself, maybe herself, as homeless. But the thing that got everyone kind of riled up about was that one question, black or white. And
Okay, can we poll the room? Because we do have a small studio audience.
in the small studio audience, black or white.
Who heard race in those words?
A number of people did,
virtually whole room. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're going to say we're not wrong because guess who wrote this poem?
So the person who wrote the poem is Anders Carlson Weems, a young, white, middle-class poet. And I will say, from what little I know of his background, he has spent a number of months writing the rails, getting kind of very familiar with homeless people in various stages along his journey. He is somebody who does not come from the Appalachian South. And one of the big things that kind of got people riled up about the poem was also, is this meant to be an Appalachian dialect? How authentic, how accurate is it to Appalachia? And if that's the case, does that speaker then need to be black or white? Why does it matter to us as readers? Why are we so invested in knowing the race of the speaker? And there were a number of people who came out both in defense of the poem and against the poem. And one of the worst attacks in the poem was the automatic assumption that because Carlson Wee is white, because he's middle class, he couldn't possibly have even heard something like this, that this was a complete fabrication. Mm-hmm. We don't know that. We don't know what and who he was speaking to, who he was involved in. We also don't necessarily know, the question of accuracy is one that's sort of fetishistic too. So somebody came in and said, well, I find this completely accurate because I come from this region. In fact, this is exactly how people speak. Does that satisfy us then? Like, why would accuracy be the thing that suddenly relieves us of this? Unless we have this idea that there's a particular kind of performance that will always be sort of speaking to an interior truth. Mm-hmm. So what is more important, the interior truth or the accurate performance? And that seemed to be the thing that everyone was the most upset about. But I looked at the poem and I thought, well, okay, one of the problems with the conversation around cultural appropriation is it's always a yes-no thing. Yes, you should culturally appropriate because that's what literature is. It's a story, it's a study of cultural appropriation over the ages. Well, you can say that, and some part of that is true, but that also ignores real bodily difference in the world, the real ways in which we all are inculcated, gendered, sexed, raced into a particular identity, and those come with costs. I could say never culturally appropriate. Appropriation is wrong. It's just absolutely disgusting. We should do that. And then, of course, we're back to, so what? We don't have a single food, we have no music, and we have no literature. Like, that ignores cultural history. So we have to reframe the debate, not along yes-no lines, which force us into dishonest positions, but along questions of desires. What are the desires that we express when we enter into an appropriative relationship with another kind of cultural product or another text or another kind of identity? So with that in mind, I thought, well, okay, let's look at the poem How To, and let's take away dialect. What do we get? Well, we get the exact same message. Really nothing changes. So what is the dialect doing except for trying to perform a persona of difference that authenticates in our mind the idea of homelessness? And I think that's what gets people upset, right? Mm-hmm. Which is not that we can't imagine someone speaking this way, that we can't imagine, in fact, perhaps, a black elder who is homeless speaking this way, but that once the dialect itself is stripped away, we get something that's kind of a weirdly inauthentic or contradictory message. The argument of the poem is you can perform whatever identity you want for somebody else to activate their sympathy. To a certain extent, that's true and not true. Certain performances cannot be acted away. If you are black, you are not going to suddenly act away blackness. And if you are white, you are, well, in this case, maybe you can, right? But that thing doesn't ring true. But then the persona, the vocal performance of the poem also insists that, in fact, there may be a history, a particular body that not only authenticates this performance, but maybe the reason for homelessness to begin with. And so that, it's like, I don't know if I'm explaining myself well here, but it seems to be wanting to have its cake and eat it too. Simultaneously saying identity, especially when you're homeless, is a series of random performances that will activate someone's sympathy, at the same time trying to become a very specific portrait of a very specific person who is homeless via that vocalization, via that dialect. And anyway, sorry.
In this same letter, I wanted to talk to you about voice, because this was clearly somebody, I think very effectively, for my purposes, speaking in a different voice, able to hit a register that would, in theory, be entirely alien to a Ivy League educated white middle class man. And yet this poem was something that did move me.
Did or didn't?
Did. No, I felt that I could see this person, and you would want that advice. If you were on the street, you'd want to, get together with that guy and learn what's what.
Yeah.
There was another way of reading this. This last line is about you hardly even there. They don't see you. I thought about this after learning more about the identity of the author. Perhaps this is about not just those who are passed by, but the passers-by. About the white, I'm assuming white people who might be passing by, or wealthier, more affluent people, and what it is they need to believe about themselves in relation to that other particularly identity marker.
Right.
So for me, when you talk about voice, it's who can speak in what voices where in ways that are heard.
Let me just say one thing about this poem. I don't actually deny the possibility that he could write in this voice, and I don't even deny the possibility that this is actually accurate to Appalachian speech. The thing that interests me about the poem is the way in which, in some ways, maybe this is also the strength of the poem, I'm willing to admit that, it sort of duplicates in one way one of its arguments for the reader, which is, if you strip away that accent, do we read this person as homeless at all? Like, in what way does the dialect then suggest otherness from the reader and
Or
activate a fantasy?
Is the complicity piece. So I'm reading this as a black woman from the south side of Chicago. You are telling me Appalachia, which is not the home of black people. That's poor white people.
Right. See, and that's where a big debate came up, where they were saying, is it black or white? And the fact that we feel the need to know, talks so much. And this is where I feel like it is unfair in the poem, because what the poem does and what it activates and where it goes in its own ways awry is in one direction. But where we go awry as readers is this desperate need, and I see this a lot in poetry, this desperate need to collapse author and product, that there is no pull apart from them between these two things. And to a certain extent, we will privilege a poem if it seems to authenticate what we already want to see in the author. And that I find incredibly frustrating, both as a writer and as a reader, because this is a burden particularly put on writers of color, which is, can you and should you then continually perform a particular kind of identity so that it satisfies the reader's desire to understand an authentic raced experience. And when you get somebody like Carlson Wee doing this, and if we did not know anything about Carlson Wee, I think a lot of people would feel the way you feel, right? That was fine. Like, I feel like I had the message performed right. Then people get very anxious about that, which is, wait, I thought only certain people should be able to express certain types of things and certain types of voices.
Okay. I'm going to hold this part of the conversation because I think Nancy will bring in a lot of that. So we've talked about reading, the complicity of readers, the expectations of readers, why we are attached to notions of identity and the need to know, the desire to know. I wondered if you might speak to the desire to represent different voices. One of the pieces of advice that you give to this would-be writer is that they be cautious and careful when they enter this space of other voices, or voices that are not naturally their own. And you talk about the ethical implications of it, and really having to know why. What is the desire to do this kind of work, this kind of writing, how to do it right. I think you give an example, or the example that I think does this really nicely, around the aesthetic device and the ethics of it is American dirt.
Yeah.
This was quite a controversy. I wonder if you might speak to that.
Just the controversy around American dirt and all of the sort of complexities
well,
around
kind
that.
of the who gets to do what.
Who gets to do what, yeah.
Paisley writes about empathy and sentimentality in when aesthetically that simply doesn't work and it's bad and it's wrong. Yeah. You also talk about racial hoaxes. I think you actually use a particular example, and then you even give us images of examples, just because we haven't really defined our terms. We're having this conversation, we haven't talked about what cultural appropriation is or appreciation.
Yeah.
Maybe this would be a good time to pull up an image,
okay.
a visual for the audience. I'm thinking of an example that was pretty close to home. A few years ago, a Utah teenager showed up at prom, and Katie is going to help us with this image.
Before we start looking at that image too, let me pull apart some of the terms that are in the term appropriation, because I think that's one of the reasons why we end up in a really fraught kind of place, because to defend appropriation in an unthinking way would sort of suggest you could be defending anything from adapting King Lear to, writing Uncle Remus. Obviously, these have very different kinds of effects. And so, one of the questions is, why do we accept certain types of appropriations and we reject other ones? So appropriation is simply taking one thing out of its context and placing it in another. It doesn't actually require that we recognize the original source, but it is the wholesale sort of removal of one thing and placing it in something else. But it includes things like adaptations. So for those of us who have written adaptations of The Tempest, say, or my entire last book of poetry, Nightingale, is an appropriative work because it rewrites Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is a form of appropriation. We call it motif appropriation, we can call it content or motif appropriation, where you're taking aspects of another work, stylistic elements, plot developments, things like that, and repurposing them. So in this case, like any creative writing classroom is filled with, people encouraging you to appropriate, go home and rewrite a fairy tale, go home and, write from the voice of X, Y, or Z person in literature. Then there's subject appropriation. This is where we get in that stickier category, where we're starting to write from the perspective of people other than the communities that we ourselves inhabit. So, if you've got a short story and the short story is written by, this last poem that I read, How To, is an example of subject appropriation. Then there's forms of cultural appropriation, where that's kind of I put that in its own category. It's a work of either subject or motif appropriation, and it goes in this direction. So we can look at this picture here, where we're obviously taking a dress out of its quote-unquote original cultural context and doing something else. So this is a young woman who was going to prom, and she was wearing a cheongsam, which is worn by pretty much any Chinese-descended person across the diaspora. On its own, wearing a cheongsam really doesn't mean anything. It's just wearing another culture's clothing. So why does this go awry? Well, I think that pose that she's making is one of the reasons it goes so awry, because she suddenly invested a cultural item with a racial meaning, and she's also gotten it wrong. I think that's something from The King and I. I don't know what that is, but that's not really something that anyone in China would be doing, but she's invested it with a sort of Orientalist fantasy. If you go to the next...
Oh, wait, stop. Look at the guys in the back.
Yeah.
What's that about?
I don't even know. I don't even go there.
It's an appropriation of kind of South Side gangster rap sort of. Did you not notice the hands?
I did, but I was afraid it was a white power sign. I'm not going to be, I'm not going to lie. I was just like, God, I don't know what that is.
I think they're trying to be like...
Well, everyone is doing a fantasy of something else, right?
This goes to desire. Why do I need to be the Asian gangster? Why do I need to be the hipster hip-hop?
Right, and this is the thing, like when people think, cultural appropriation happens as soon as you put on somebody else's, or eat somebody else's food, or listen to someone else's music. I don't argue that I don't think that that's what's happening. I mean, your desire might just be, I want to appreciate this, I enjoy this. when it starts to go awry is when you have to load it with a kind of particular innate racial meaning that is a performative meaning that you yourself have to take on in order to somehow enjoy it. So if we go to Katy Perry, which I just think is so funny. So some of you might have seen Katy Perry's video Unconditionally from the VMA Awards. And if you know Katy Perry's song, it's simply a song about how a woman will love her lover unconditionally. Regardless of what, insecurities he or she displays, she's there for it. So why dress up as a geisha? I mean, well, okay, anyone who's read Edward Said and watched Madame Butterfly or M. Butterfly or read that play knows that, in fact, this is a trope, a very famous Orientalist trope that gets replicated constantly, which is that comes from this story of a Japanese geisha who falls in love with an American serviceman. She has a child, he threatens to leave her and then take the child. Then he says he is going to do it. She, out of misery, kills herself. And it's this replicated trope of basically the idea that how an Asian woman loves is effectively suicidal. So when Katy Perry sings this song and she wears this outfit and puts on this performance, she moves from, if she'd been singing a completely different song and been wearing a geisha costume, that would have been weird, it would have been appropriative, but it wouldn't have verged the line into cultural appropriation and racism. Because what she's doing here is she's making the argument that this is how Asian women are. She's collapsed, if you go to the next slide, actually. Keep going, I think. So basically, it's basically any kind of work or any kind of act that engages in cultural appropriation traffics in stereotypes that link bodily and cultural difference with innate physical and mental characteristics. So they're works that ask us not just to perceive a character's racial difference, but to see how those external characteristics stand in metaphorically for more profound interior difference that itself can't change. So, and this is the important thing, artistic appropriation itself does not require that an artist reflect racist values. But oftentimes appropriation occurs because the artist's ideas of people of color are racist. So that's why I want to pull these things apart and sort of say there are appropriative practices that we all engage in, that we accept, because they don't do that. They don't collapse the outer and the inner to suggest that there is an unbridgeable and authentic interior difference. That in order, so to make this sign suddenly makes one black, or to wear this dress suddenly makes you have to behave in this Orientalist kind of way. But that example of the teens is sort of like, this appropriation occurs because, it's not that she just liked the dress, she liked the idea of the Asianness itself. And you see this occasionally in literature, and I talk about where we see it. Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah, I will transition because I think this will take us to where we see it and maybe what we imagine, or maybe this is a really strained attempt to connect this. But you also talk about the racial hoax.
Yeah.
And the costs and consequences of appropriative action. I actually was not aware of Yifan Chu.
Yeah.
Could you tell us who that is?
So Yifan Chu is the pen name of a man, Michael Derek Hudson, who got a poem published in a small journal that then got picked up in Best American Poetry, it's a big deal to be in Best American Poetry. A lot of people want to be in it. And he admitted, in fact, he was picked by Sherman Alexie, and Sherman Alexie had said, because he was the editor that year, he was like, I was specifically looking for people who had not been represented by Best American Poetry before. And actually, as somebody who has edited Best American Poetry, what's interesting is that for many, many years, you would be lucky if you saw one Asian name. For years. I'm, in fact, the first person of Asian descent to ever helm that journal, that anthology. So Sherman Alexie was probably very much looking for Asian American names. So he picks Yifan Chu, and then Michael Derek Hudson says, actually, sorry, I'm a white guy. And so Sherman Alexie did the right thing. He said, I'm gonna publish it. And he said, you can say what you want in the back. I chose the poem. And so Michael Derek Hudson then proceeds to say, well, I was unable to get this poem published. I submitted 40 different times to 40 different journals, and it was rejected. So I slapped this name on it, and it got published miraculously. And interestingly, Nancy's book about identity capitalism will work beautifully with this problem, right? There's right now we're in a place that journals and editors and and institutions like the University of Utah are desperate to get more diversity, more representation in their journals, in their faculty, and all this sort of stuff. And it creates a perfect opportunity for a term that Nancy coined, identity entrepreneurs, like Michael Derrick Hudson, to understand that in a white-helmed world, desperate for diversity, there is a capital market now to perform ideas of these kinds of diversity. And we can easily, basically take on a pen name and beat the writing establishment at its own game. Interestingly, when I was writing this, I was focusing mostly on literary fakes, but when I turned in the last proofs, and it was too late to go back, a whole raft of racial fakes from the Academy started appearing. And it makes perfect sense. In systems that are pretty much run largely by white editors, white publicists, white administrators, the desperate desire to have people represent physically, not just intellectually, these different disciplines becomes enormous. And it's not enough anymore to write a poem. One would have to suddenly be that person, supposedly to be marketable. That's the white racists, the white entrepreneurs, identity entrepreneurs' way of thinking. And so there's been a number of literary hoaxes over the years that have capitalized on exactly this kind of anxiety. And it is a massive problem because oftentimes what they do is they perform an idea of what that cultural identity should be that has already been reframed for writers of color. It is usually a non-challenging, sentimental, traumatic or traumatized portrait of a person of color or of a woman, which makes it easy to digest, easy to sympathize with, and easy to market. And we keep falling for it over and over and over again. And of course, the replication of this creates a tremendous problem for writers of color and artists of color who then have to either rewrite or respond to these things, and oftentimes it just means they end up having to reperform a different kind of trauma. And it again becomes this odd market colonialist practice where everyone ends up eliding the writer of color with various forms of racist trauma that they've experienced, that they must reenact, that they must write about in order to authenticate their experiences different from the white writers, but then also to perform for a market that's hungry for precisely those narratives. And that takes us to American Dirt, but I'll leave it there.
All right, and I am going to bring in our guest reader. So this is new. We are going to be joined by Nancy Leong. Nancy will be brought up on screen shortly and will correct me on pronunciation if needed. I don't know that we've met in person ever, but I've just really appreciated and enjoyed your work and think the world of you and your colleagues at Denver. Nancy graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern University before attending Stanford Law School, where she graduated with distinction and was a member of the Stanford Law Review. She clerked for Judge Kermit Lipset of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit prior to joining the University of Denver faculty. She was an assistant professor at William and Mary and at American University Washington College of Law. She's the author of over 30 law review articles and essays. Her interests include constitutional rights, criminal procedure, remedies, anti-discrimination, law and culture, hence her presence here at a humanities event. And her scholarship has appeared in the California Law Review, the Harvard Law Review, Stanford's Law Review, Yale Law Journal, among others. And her first book, Identity Capitalist, was published by Stanford University Press this year, 2021. She will be joining us at the law school later in the year for a conversation, but because I had both of these books on my shelf and was reading them at the same time, I wanted to bring these reader-writers together to respond to one another. So with that, Nancy, welcome.
Thank you so much for a really kind introduction.
Yes. Yes.
This really took me back, and like, do I have to talk about what we all? I had a number of different strands that I thought I would try to pull out, and maybe try to engage some of those connections in a way that I hope is profitable. I was really, as I read this book, I became really interested in the question of audience, and in relation to my own work, who the audience is shapes the types of commodities that are valued. So you mentioned a moment ago this type of market colonialism, right? And how there are demands for certain types of racialized performances. So I became really interested in the question of audience as I was reading the book, thinking about what I wanted to talk about today. And I really enjoyed the format of the book, which of course is
so cool.
The series of letters to a student. You have chosen a very specific listener, right? This anonymous young white student. And I also realized that I saw this student as a young white woman. I don't think that came from you. I think that came from me. And I didn't realize that until I was pretty far into the book, right? I paused to reflect, and I couldn't remember really whether you said that or whether that came from me. And I ultimately chose not to go back specifically to try to figure that out, but I think it came from me. So I'll just put that out there. But the thing that really caused me to reflect is that I realized that by choosing to write the book as a series of letters, you made explicit something that I also do, but literally until I read your book, unconsciously in my own writing, which is that you're writing for a young white person, perhaps a woman, and I realized so am I a lot of the time, and I never set out to do that. The person I often envision as I write is a young white person, like most of my students. And it's that person that I'm trying to compel or to interest or to persuade. I might pause here and just say that because of the format, I'm able to hear you but not see you. So if there's ever a moment when it might be useful to interject, maybe just interrupt me would be the easiest way.
Oh, Nancy, so you're good to go. We were just going to give you free reign for 10 minutes, and then I think Paisley will respond.
Oh,
okay, fantastic, fantastic. I was talking away and I wondered, are they,
we're out smoking a cigarette somewhere else. We're not even in the room.
Okay, but so anyway, that was a really interesting experience for me, and it gave me a lot of pause about myself. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that, and that'll give me something to think about for a long time. But that made me wonder more generally, well, who are we writing for by default? And more generally, we can think about who we're performing for, who we're painting for, or really, any activity with an audience. But I'll stay with writing for now. You say in the book that we are trained to empathize with white characters by default. This made me consider our authors also trained to write for white readers by default. Or to put a gloss on this question, is part of the reason that cultural appropriation is problematic, that authors, presume themselves and are presumed by others to be writing for a white audience, with the idea that the white audience is then dictating what forms of cultural presentation are deemed desirable. Is that part of the problem with it? And I actually was really interested in the discussion of American dirt as well. And, I think, obviously, like the reason many people took issue with this book is because the author is, we could say white or white adjacent, I suppose. And she is writing, not from her own subject position. But also, perhaps one reason people took issue with this book is also that both the author and society at large are presuming a white audience, right? And so the idea is that this white adjacent person is repackaging this story about brown migrants and using that to profit, because there is this demand that is created by a white audience. And, if she had written this story in her journal, I don't know that people would think it would even be problematic, right? Even on a micro level. And the author talked about, Cummins talked about being a bridge, presumably between the stories of brown migrants and white readers who don't know much about them. And, the concern here, I think, is at least partly that white readers will think that this story is authentic and that now that they've read it, they know all about this situation. And so perhaps this, this mistaken belief is what will lead to the displacement, or we could say the depression of demand for more authentic voices. But again, all of this assumes a white reader, just like I did without really thinking about it, right? Like if we imagine a world in which the only readers of American dirt were themselves brown readers who are well-versed in the struggles of migrants at the border, maybe we wouldn't worry about this book. Like we wouldn't care about, what the author is doing. And so, perhaps the issue with the book, or the thing that troubles us about cultural appropriation, is not only the identity of the author or her approach to the topic, it's those things in relation to the audience for whom she's writing. This then caused me to think about, my own work and my own, we could call it position in the academy. And so if I can talk about my own world, and I guess Erica's world for just a moment, we're lawyers and legal scholars. And so of course the writing that makes up my intellectual world is often legal writing, which means books and articles by and for other legal scholars, and opinions and briefs by and for judges and lawyers. And most of the universe of legal writing is, it's not just writing by white guys, although it is. It's also for an audience of white guys, other judges, other lawyers, other legal scholars. And, it goes even deeper, right? Because in America, since we're a common law system, what that means is when a court decides a case, that case becomes precedent for the next court. So the first decision on a particular issue generally needs to be followed by the second. Judges tend to, quote the words of previous judges to make their opinions more persuasive. And so what that does is, for 2 centuries, we had a system where white men are writing for an audience of other white men, sometimes on topics that white men don't experience firsthand, ever. And that's really interesting to me because, just in the past, we could talk about what number of years exactly. I think it was 1981 when Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman on the Supreme Court. So, we could say roughly 40 years. The profession has become a lot more diverse. And so what that means, I think, is that lawyers have really had a crash course in writing for audiences that aren't their own group, right? Like we know when a brief doesn't work, like when it did something problematic because the judge doesn't like it. And so I think that type of feedback is maybe crystallized in the legal profession in a way that it isn't necessarily in other places. But so then the place that brought me to, I think it's a useful exercise to think about how appropriate, for example, might have been different if it were written for a different audience. So like, how would the book have been different if it were written as a series of letters to a young, let's say, biracial Asian student, or a young African-American student? Is that even something we can imagine, or is this exercise fundamentally incoherent? Do young people who aren't white need or have use for an essay about appropriation that is for them, right? That is written with them as an audience. I think maybe they do, but I don't know what that would look like. And I think that's an interesting question. Like, how much of what we write about is either explicitly, like your book, or implicitly, like I guess everything I've written in my entire life? How much of it is written for white people? And then how much does the demand of the audience for particular types of commodities, whether that's information, right, like what your student wanted, or whether it's particular types of racial narratives or racial performances, how does that demand shape what gets written, whether we think about it explicitly or whether we don't?
Okay, Nancy.
And then I think the place I'll end with is, as we think about, you raised my concept of identity entrepreneurs, and just the idea of performing or leveraging your own identity when there's a demand for it in some sense. And, I think maybe the place where our works come together a little bit is this idea that particular audiences express particular types of demands for particular types of discussions, cultural performances, racial performances, and so on. And so, as we analyze and figure out what we think about cultural appropriation, I think an important question is always what's in it for the author. Like, is this a situation where an author is doing something to benefit themselves?
Yeah.
Which sounds like it was the case for, I'm sorry, I can't remember the author's name, but the one who posed as an Asian American writer that we were talking about.
Yeah, Michael there.
Just before, yes, just before I started speaking. It seems to me that author was leveraging a particular type of identity performance, right? One that wasn't their own, to get a benefit for themselves. I think that question of motivation might be central to all of this. And, to go to your questions at the ends of appropriate, I noticed none of them included the word why. And although you do talk about it earlier in the book. Mm-hmm. And I want to suggest that maybe the why matters too. Like why are particular types of performances valued by particular audiences? Mm-hmm. And then why do particular authors engage in certain types of presentations in response to those demands? So I think that's probably a good place for me to stop. Okay. And I really look forward to hearing other thoughts, other comments.
Great. So I thank you so much, Nancy. That was incredible.
That was great.
I want to invite, because I know we are closing. You are supposed to respond to that. But there is an audience with us and on our live stream. Hello, everyone. I wanted to make sure that we didn't run out of time for questions from the audience, unless the audience would like to hear her reaction. It's really hard to poll a room with masks. I can't really tell. I think I'm seeing nodding yes that Paisley should respond because she is the writer person in the room. Okay, there you go.
Okay, so I'm going to try and hit as many points as possible really fast because I know we don't have a lot of time. So I thought a lot about who I was writing for in this book, and for the exact reasons that she was mentioning. If it had been addressed to another writer of color, there might have been actually a curious deficiency in the book, which is I would have spoken in shorthand. Yeah. And I would not, there was the value of thinking through these things relies upon someone who, in this sort of imagined dialogue, I imagine would have less personal exposure and less personally automatically at stake. And so I wanted to think about who is going to push me to have to articulate everything as clearly as possible. That said, speaking and teaching younger writers of color, one of the things that I find interesting is that they don't know much more about race in weird ways than white people. I mean, they have a more personal experience of the historic legacies of race and what race means on a day-to-day moment. But if you were to say, could you define Orientalism to them, they might not be able to do it, but they would know it when they saw it, if that makes sense, right? So that there was a real importance in getting all of that sort of terminology out there. But the question that is implicit to all of the things that she's bringing up is, in the conversation around cultural appropriation, there's two questions. One is, can it be done? And if it can be done, what are the skills? What are the philosophical? What are the, intellectual, creative, what are those requirements? What can you do to prepare? The other one is, should it be done? And should it be done is about this question of audience, and it is this question of the ways in which whiteness particularly works in not just as an audience, but that anyone who's been sort of in the sausage-making machine of literature knows it's whiteness all the way down. Your agent is white. Your first, the copy editors at the agency are white. The publicists are white. Your editor is white. And all of the comps, the comparable titles that your book is up against are written by white authors. So even if you did figure your readership as a very particular kind of readership, your first channels are through whiteness to get to that readership anyway. Whiteness is inescapable. And what's fascinating is there's a book that just came out, and it's killing me. I think MIT Press published it, actually, and it's about just counting the numbers of what is the racial demographic of writers published post-war, and it is like 87% white. I mean, it's not even close to 50-50. And if they did, there's a hashtag What Publishing Paid Me, and people were talking about just the stark difference in advances that writers of color get versus white writers. So this question of audience is fraught also by the fact that there's a market, that is set up around whiteness and perceptions of whiteness, so that even how you want to imagine your audience might not in fact be that person that comes out in the end either. So we get to American Dirt. And I think American Dirt is a fascinating case for so many of the reasons that she articulated, but it is an example of how a white adjacent author wants to create an incredibly sympathetic portrait. And if you just read it, you would say this is a person who bent over backwards not to appear racist. I mean, anything that even verged on something exoticizing or racist was immediately backed off in horror. But one of the things that makes this novel appropriative has nothing, or I should say, has less to do with the writing and has almost everything to do with the machinery around the writing, which is the book presents, it's a thriller, and it presents America as this endpoint for migrants to achieve after going through a tremendous number of traumatizing experiences. All of the main characters are young women or middle-aged women who are very attractive and who have like lovely children who are already biracial because they've been watching YouTube videos. They are utterly unthreatening. They are raped. They are beaten. They are passive. They are active in their escape, but they are ultimately not active in their ability to fight back in any other kind of way. So they're easy to imagine assimilating. And the people one of the women who, Sandra Cisneros, who blurbed the book said, I've chose to blurb this book because it's clearly written for white people. She's like, this is a Trojan horse. If I, with my name and my face, write a book about the migrant crisis, white people will not read it because they will assume, I already know what this woman's going to say. I already know what this woman's position is going to be. And I already, and in that sense, she is granted automatically less imaginative freedom than Jeanine Cummins. So Cummins is doing her best to write the most accurate and sensitive portrayal she can. That is telegraphed on the page. However, she has also stripped all of the politics out of the novel. So it is merely a thriller it's a horror story, basically. So that you don't have to know anything about the migrant crisis. You don't have to care at all about the border policy itself or know anything. You can just thrill to what happens to them. And the idea is that maybe at the end of this, you'll be more sympathetic to migrants once they do cross the border. So it is absolutely, that's why it got like a 6-figure advance. That's why Oprah picked it. That's why all these things, because it could appeal to a very large audience that had no political kind of capital in this or political skin in this game. And I was thinking of this, essay by James Baldwin about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is everybody's protest novel. And Baldwin is like, this is a novel that presents slavery as utterly horrifying, because it is. But weirdly, it keeps intact the Christian theology and Christian worldview that also in the novel itself is used to support and promulgate slavery. And so there's this curious way in which all we have to do is thrill to these horrible stories of what are happening, and feel sentimentally moved, but we don't actually have to question any of the values that the readership itself continues to support that also fuel slavery. And American Dirt works the exact same way. You can read this novel and feel utterly horrible about what happens to people in La Bestia and not lift a finger to stop the migrant crisis. And I think, but that also is one of the frustrations I have with the way also when we think about why we should be mad at how to, or why we should be mad at these things, that to a certain extent what we're really mad about are larger structural problems, the larger structural problems of how audience is created, how marketplaces are created, how migrant crises are created, how racial identities are forged. And we can't do anything about those, so we take it out on the authors. So I am actually quite sympathetic to that's why the whole thing around American Dirt felt to me both historically justified but really personally unfair. This is a woman who's working in a system that was designed for someone to do that, and she just happened to fit it. So anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was fabulous. I'm just going to end with Paisley's words, and we can, those of us who are in the room, continue with questions. I think what you've managed to do in this conversation is address most, if not all, of my questions. This notion of why sentimentality can be injurious, why appropriation can be harmful, why it may also be necessary to have something that is approximating as we introduce ourselves to issues. I think you've also shown us the power of the reader and what we have ourselves as that, and the invitation to self-reflection. But here, this is for your letter, Identity is Encounter. To understand that we are each, at best, a set of relations and possibilities, not inevitabilities, is the great lesson to be learned. So,
Thanks.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Oh, and thank you to the technology team making this possible. Thank you so very much. And thank you to my team and staff again.
Thank you.
Okay.